Hey, it's Soul, and we're back with some more Shadowlands coverage. Today we're going to focus on some research and feedback on travel times, a nerdy but still important measure of our gameplay in the upcoming expansion. That's because Shadowlands did something very unique with its zones. First off, each zone isn't merely a landmass or an island. Okay, well, in practice it is, but it's meant to feel like an entirely new realm, and we're just seeing a small piece of Bastion and Maldraxxus, Ardenweald and Revendreth. So when using a flight point to travel between one zone and another, you will always end up traveling first to Oribos, the main hub of Shadowlands, and then to your desired zone, through what I'm going to call transit corridors, these wormhole-like tunnels, and we'll be examining the pros and cons of this new approach. My early impressions of this left me pretty impressed, because when traveling across zones, there's no noticeable loading screen except in certain conditions, meaning the realms of Shadowlands all exist on the same plane. This is less of a big deal when you think about it though, considering the other expansion areas in WoW, apart from Cataclysm, have for the most part existed on the same plane too, just that they're spread across an incredible distance. It gives this feeling that the Shadowlands is very, very big. But speaking for myself, this can lead to some negative effects, both visually and psychologically, which leads me to the subject of this video: how long does it take to travel between zones? Considering this is the alpha, of course we can totally count on travel times to be adjusted from build to build, but I thought it'd be a good idea to let you know how things are looking and feeling now. I mean, how else are you gonna fuel your hatred for not being able to fly day one of Shadowlands, right? Haha, you gotta keep fighting the good fight and all that. To conduct these tests, I unlocked as many flight points as I could in each zone, and, by the way, the Maw is not available for testing at the moment, but we can confidently proceed with testing and feedback without it. So let's begin with two control tests from earlier expansions, from one flight point to another very far away flight point. Here's a flyover of Kultiris, and I'm obviously going to be time-lapsing all of these tests, so here we go. So about 3.5 minutes, whoop-de-doo. Let's compare this to Legion now, from one point to another faraway point. A little bit shorter in this case, but I could have flown all the way to Shield's Rest for a maximum distance. It's just not a normal place that people fly to, but whatever the case, we can at least conclude that thanks to Kultiris and Zandalar being separate continents, travel time in Battle for Azeroth was lengthened for many, thanks to having to travel via boat between continents. So with that in mind, how will Shadowlands work when every zone is crazy far apart? Let's start with a visit to Revendreth, the 4th zone. We're just going to measure how long it takes to fly from Dominant's Keep to the west to Prideful Hamlet in the east. This is just a check to see how long it takes to cross a single Shadowlands zone. So that was a little bit over a minute and a half, but let's recap and look back at the footage. At the moment, the flight paths are a little bit unrefined because the taxi mount dips really close to each of the waypoints on the way to the hamlet. We can count on a smoother, if not shorter ride when Shadowlands goes live. Here's another test, this time in Ardenweald, from Claw's Edge to Dreamsong Fen. It's a closer distance from the Revendreth testing, but it's still worth recording. And that's about a minute. Nothing too surprising here, other than that the flight itself is like super pretty, right? So like I mentioned earlier, the unique thing about traveling across the Shadowlands is this transit corridor that bridges each of the realms back to Oribos and then back again. I should say that at the moment, you always fly through Oribos first and not directly to another zone, but I also want to leave it open that there could always be ways to travel directly to zones. We're just going to have to see as the alpha progresses and we might see a new feature come in. But anyway, you can see your map icon while traveling through these corridors real time, and you're going at a fairly fast speed. But how long does it take to travel from each zone back to Oribos? Let's measure how long it takes to travel from each of the zone's closest flight points before using corridors to complete this trip to Oribos. Interesting. It's a range from about 50 seconds to a minute just to fly through these corridors. Testing this was a bit weird, and let me enunciate this better. If you are flying through Oribos to another zone, the time it takes to fly through a corridor changes. If I were to fly from Maldraxxus all the way to Bastion, suddenly that minute and a half jumps to 2 minutes just to move through this corridor alone, which I think is a bug actually. I'll tell you why later. Meanwhile, if I fly from Ardenweald to Maldraxxus, I blast through this corridor in under 40 seconds. Now let's go back to Dominant's Keep, which is deep inside Revendreth. If we wanted to travel straight to Oribos, we would still need to fly through the remainder of the zone, as you can see from the flight connections here. But you might notice, and it's a little bit subtle, that when connecting to Oribos, or otherwise traveling to another zone that will make you fly through Oribos, you go a little bit faster. Maybe it's hard to tell, so let's do a side-by-side comparison of the speed between flying from Dominant's Keep to Prideful Hamlet to flying from Dominant's Keep to Oribos while passing through Prideful Hamlet. Very easy to understand, I get it. But let's see who makes it to Prideful Hamlet first. Conducting similar tests in other zones yield the same results. When selecting a flight point that will take you through Oribos, flying through the zone gets a little bit faster, probably to compensate for traveling through those transit corridors. These transit corridors do take up a considerable amount of time, but how much time do they add relative to your total travel time? In these tests, we'll travel from Ardenweald to Maldraxxus and choose the shortest flight points between them. And then we'll travel from Revendreth to Ardenweald. Okay, so after these tests, we have about 2 to 2.5 minutes between the closest flight points to each zone, but it's roughly a minute and a half that was just taking place in a corridor. Next, I measured how long it took to travel from deep within one zone to deep within another. In this case, it's from the Ionian Archives in Bastion to Claw's Edge in Ardenweald. Surprise, surprise, this one took a while. It's comparable to the longest flight times possible in Legion, and traveling through corridors took up nearly half the time. There were a few interesting finds, maybe bugs, when I tried conducting more of these long tests, flying from deep within a zone to deep within another zone. In this test, we're going to fly from Dreamsong Fen in Ardenweald to Dominant's Keep over in Revendreth. You might have missed that one, so let's rewind. You see here, I ran into a load screen and just skipped. I just skipped straight to the end, which is a little bit neat, if jarring. And here's a similar result, flying from Maldraxxus to the Ionian Archives in Bastion. I get to a certain point, and then I just skip to the end. At first I thought, maybe there's a maximum time before the game just throws its hands up and teleports you to your intended destination. In this case, I even got teleported while I was in the corridor towards Bastion. However, when I fly from Carrie's Rest in Maldraxxus to Charred Ramparts in Revendreth, it takes a considerably longer time before I'm teleported to my final destination. I showed you this earlier, but when flying from the Ionian Archives in Bastion to Claw's Edge in Ardenweald, there's no skip at all. So here's some specific and mostly personal feedback. I have two problems with these transit corridors, you might have noticed. One feels obvious in that it takes up a considerable amount of travel time with very little to look at. Two is that what you get to look at is, at least for me, kind of disorienting. Visual stimuli is taken differently from player to player. Not everyone can handle playing a first-person shooter, while others can play them just fine, but they can't stand watching someone else play it on a VOD or a stream. Specific to this, that line of energy that's being used as a point of reference, it successfully gives that feeling of being twisted up and down and in circles, but too long of an exposure to this makes me uncomfortable. I want to look away. As for the question of whether flight times are longer or shorter than previous expansions, the difference is negligible at best. But the lack of visual stimuli can make the feeling of travel in Shadowlands feel longer, maybe more boring, and that feeling is all you need to draw an opinion. So I have two suggestions. One is to make the corridor feel a little bit more stationary, like removing the energy line and or making the corridor straight. It would help our travel through here feel more stable. The second is to make this corridor experience considerably shorter than it is now. In fact, I would want to mandate that travel time through corridors be no more than 20 seconds, and 15 seconds if you're flying through Oribos to travel from zone to zone, for a total of 30 seconds. I hope that that would be enough to preload content, but I do understand that some computers and internet connection speeds are faster than others. And the corridors aren't all that bad. They are a really cool effect that sells the theme of traveling through realms. My favorite part of these corridors is, funny enough, when it ends, right? And the environment explodes to life right in front of you. Sitting in this vertigo of a load screen can get old. So does taking taxi after taxi, but at least there's more aesthetically pleasing stuff to stimulate us in the actual zones. I'm willing to bet that these corridors will cause visual problems for a small but significant enough number of people that Blizzard will need to change this. That, or we'll see the usual memes we see when it comes to flight times and /time played, the typical pressure. As a fallback option, Blizzard should also be prepared to abandon the transit corridors altogether and just go back to load screens. Now that would suck, but covering reports of nausea in an expansion meant to make up for the shortcomings of Battle for Azeroth, that would be a blemish that can and should be scuffed out early. That's my feedback so far, and I hope that no one got too dizzy watching this. Of course, it was a lot of fun for me to get this footage and edit it, whoop-de-doo. But let me know what you think. If this information was useful or interesting, leave a like, and subscribe for more of this and all things Warcraft. We'll see you next time. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.